PPP is a label that's applied to lots of different things, but if we concentrate on infrastructure, PPPs are used to provide a piece of infrastructure, a physical asset like a road or a school or a water treatment plant, and the service on the back of that over the lifetime of the asset. So basically what a PPP is, it's a long-term contract for infrastructure between the public sector and the private sector, whereby the private sector takes on the role of designing, building, operating, and in most cases financing the investment in the infrastructure. So that's different from traditional procurement models, whereby the state would have different contracts for different stages of, we'll say, the infrastructure delivery. So they'd have one contract for delivery, one contract for build, and then it would the asset would be taken back into the public sector for operation. That's the old way of doing things. We'll say traditional procurement. It still accounts for maybe over 90% of procurement in Ireland, but PPP has grown over the last, we'll say, 13 or 14 years, and is set to grow more because the government, in the context of its stimulus plan that it announced in July 2012, has charted out a path for more PPP investment, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Value for money is one metric that people use in order to judge the performance of PPP. It's not necessarily the only one, but in the language of PPP, it's the one that's put forward as the objective of PPP. What it actually means by definition, if there is one, is that the lifetime cost, the whole life cost of the asset under PPP is cheaper, and the quality is the same, or if not better, than you would have got by doing it the old way under traditional or conventional procurement methods. The problem with establishing value for money is that these are long-term contracts, and you won't really be able to tell until the end of the contract whether value for money was achieved. And you need two numbers to compare, so you have to compare it against something hypothetical. What would it have cost if you used traditional procurement? So there's no straightforward answer to that question. Having said that, the public sector is obliged to appraise potential PPP projects for value for money before they go down the PPP route. So they actually do have to do this exercise of comparing the two numbers. In Ireland, we have very limited data that's available on value for money. They're just not put, the value for money assessments are not put in the public domain. They are to some degree or other in other jurisdictions like Australia and Canada, and there's a real challenge there for us that I think is easily met to put this data out so that we can all interrogate these issues around PPP and understand how PPPs work. We can do that better. On the basis of the data that is there, it's hard to the data suggests that there is some value for money to be gained, but the magnitudes are not staggeringly high. You're talking around, say, 6% for the court service buildings, 6% for, less than 1% for the National Convention Centre. They're small figures, and there are question marks. There will always be questions over the accuracy of those estimates as well. The jury's out on whether they actually provide value for money or whether they're necessarily the best model. So there really is a case for an independent, government-funded review of the experience to date, with full access to information. Along the lines of some of the reports that the Controller and Auditor General has done, but there are not enough of those out there to help people make a judgment in relation to whether this works. That's the first thing. In terms of what's driving this, what's the real reason behind the new drive for PPP is off-balance sheet financing. The investments don't show up on the books, as it were. In other words, the calculation of the general government deficit and the general government debt in accordance with the rules set by the EU do not include PPP investments if certain conditions around risk transfer actually hold. And that means that most of the investments, and we're talking about 5.5 to 6 billion of investments under PPP to date, is actually, it's there, it's debt, but it's not included in the official general government debt. It's public debt, but it's not general government debt, which is the metric we are obliged to keep our eyes on in terms of the fiscal compact, etc. Because of off-balance sheet financing, this is encouraging the use of PPP, but given the fact that we have huge infrastructure gaps, it's inevitable that there's going to be more PPP investment by virtue of the fact that it allows for investment, which is the big goal, but on the other hand, it doesn't show up on the books, as it were, and we keep within the fiscal constraints that we're bound by. So we're going to have more of that. What we really need is actually scrutiny then of these individual investments to make sure that they are delivering value for money and they're delivering quality infrastructure on the back of which we provide public services that everybody needs in order to live their lives. Are there alternatives? Well, the obvious alternative would, if you go back to traditional procurement, is to change the fiscal rules, change how these things are recorded, which will actually allow them to be recorded. For instance, capital investment in its entirety could be removed from the calculation of the, say, fiscal aggregates that the country has to keep an eye on in order to keep it in constraints. And there's been calls for that at a European level to change the way that the fiscal aggregates are accounted for, in order to allow the fiscal space for countries to invest in much needed infrastructure. I mean, worldwide, the estimate is that even if infrastructure quality and levels are to be kept up in 2020, okay, or I got the years wrong, in 2050, are to be at the level that they are now, it'll cost $57 trillion, okay? Infrastructure deficits are universal, across developed countries, emerging economies, developing economies, and so on. So there's a huge need for investment in infrastructure worldwide, and it makes no sense, especially now when the returns on investment are going to be high because finance is cheap and so on. It's a real pity that these fiscal rules are constraining governments and forcing them perhaps to go down the PPP route necessarily. Off-balance sheet financing should not be the criterion for making decisions on investment. The criterion should be always whether a project delivers net social benefits. Do costs or do benefits exceed costs in a social sense? And that should always be the metric, not this fooling around with accounting rules. Irish Water is not a PPP, of course. Okay, what the government have decided to do is set up a state-owned enterprise along the lines of the ESB or Bord Gáis or CIE and take in the functions in relation to water infrastructure and services that were previously undertaken by local authorities. So in economic terms, it probably makes sense to actually go down the route that they've gone, because they can achieve economies of scale and scope, which should result in more cost-efficient delivery of services and ultimately lower prices to consumers. The other element, of course, of what they've done is they've decided to fund the infrastructure investment that will be implemented by Irish Water through a mix of transfers from the Exchequer, like it always was, but also with part of the funding coming from user charges. There are, again, I believe there are strong economic rationales for user charges of a scarce resource like water. Some would argue that water is a human right, and it is certainly to a point. But when you think about it deeply, nobody has the right to waste the resource, and unless there are some incentives there, like pricing, to regulate the usage of water, you'll have waste. So, by and large, I think the government have actually gone down the right route in terms of setting up the new utility and introducing water charges. But of course, where they've got it wrong is they've misjudged it politically. But that's a separate issue. It's not an economic issue. It's worth emphasising that part of the new structure is been driven by the fact that the investment that will be undertaken by the new utility, again, like investments made by the ESB or CIE, they will not be included as part of the general government debt. They will be part of public debt, but the rules of accounting allow it be kept off balance sheet. And there's no question that that's driving this. I don't think that off balance sheet financing should necessarily be what governs decisions in relation to this, but that's just a fact of life, and that's the way it's been done.